Thank you very much, and thank you for this warm welcome, which I got translated, so I understood it. I've been looking very much forward to join this group today. I have been working a bit in Poland and a bit in Czech, and in this part of the world, if I may say, the new European spirit is really great to experience, because when you have a challenge down here, you always say, we can surely solve it. We can surely solve the challenge. Whereas in the spoiled part of the old Europe, a challenge is always getting bigger than it used to be. So I really like the spirit that I always feel when I'm here. What I have brought today for you is just a small selection of slides on my subjective view on what does it mean to be a evaluating board. And anything that I will say here is not theoretically correct or is not justified by statistics, or it's just my own subjective reflections from the work I've been doing. I consider myself a practitioner. I've been working in different jobs. I have been with a company that works with IT systems called CCI Europe, which delivers advanced solutions to newspapers all over the world. Lego, everybody knows that. I was involved in that development back in the 90s, and in the first part of this millennium, I've been CEO of Bang & Olufsen. And since 2008, I have only worked on various boards of companies. Some of the names are more known than others. Electrolux, I think everybody knows that company, fairly big in Sweden. I'm deputy there and chairman of the audit committee and member of the nomination committee. Egmont Foundation is not so known. We are doing a lot of books and magazines, in the biggest one in Scandinavia, actually, or among the biggest. Pandora is a rather new company which was started not so long ago and which went on the stock market in 10. And there I have been chairman and I'm now member of the board. And Lego I joined since 2003 when the company was in a bit of a crisis, and we are now doing well again. So I have experience from privately owned companies, foundation-owned companies. That is something that is quite frequent in Denmark and in Scandinavia, that owner makes a foundation which then owns a company for the long term. Listed companies also, and private equity I work with, as well as ventures and startups, because I'm always involved in a number of smaller companies in different parts of, I would say, Northern Europe. So I really enjoy this. I must say at the outstart, I only know about industrial companies. I know nothing about banking. I know nothing about public-owned companies. And I know very little about public administration in general. So I'm only an industrialist, if I may say it like that. I have two questions that I would like to dive into. Why is it that I think we need, as the chairman said, a transition in our boards from, you could say, passive to active? Why do I think that is needed? And the other question is, what kind of professional and personal qualities, in my own experience, do I think that we need? And it's, of course, impossible to say something in general, but allow me to come with some ideas and reflections on that topic. But before I dive into the topic today, I just would like to highlight two different, if you will, mindsets or approaches to the idea of governance. When I am in Brussels and speak with people who are close to the Commission or the central bureaucracy over in Brussels and in Strasbourg, I always feel people start with what are the rules, what is in the EU governance standards and the OECD principles and so on, which of course is important. And from there, they then think a lot about how do we make a compliance-driven board, which makes sure there are no errors and that we fulfill all the rules and regulations. And only little time is devoted to the management of the company. Now it goes a little different here. My approach is to start with, in a given company, what is it that the circumstances demand on management, on the executive team, and from there I ask myself, what is in the best business-driven government? So I distinguish a little bit between compliance-driven and business-driven governance. Of course, both cases we need control, we need accountability, but over here it's about creating value, where maybe on the left side it's a little bit more about avoiding errors. And I'm not saying what is good or bad, I'm just saying where I come from. I sort of start with the executive management And from there, I of course always take into consideration what are the guidelines, the rules, and so on that we of course need to fulfill, because many of those are very healthy and very good and are helping companies go forward. But I do start at the bottom. That said, let me dive into the first question about the transition. It's obviously for everyone that the world has changed a lot in the last 10 years, from being predictable, from being more incremental, into where we could use a ritual board, which was not so engaged, with a rather weak governance. Didn't have to meet so often, didn't have to be so engaged, was more there as a formal entity. But today, with the global markets hitting more or less all industries, intertwining industries, you don't know what Amazon or Google does tomorrow with your business, with disruptive technologies coming across all over, and impermanence. The picture for many managers is more like this: we are standing on an ice flake, and we don't know how long that flake will carry us and where we're now jumping next. The slide is actually taken from one of the companies that I'm involved in the publishing sector, where a lot of digital change means that we don't know exactly what to do next. It's not a simple landscape we work in. So management often today has this challenge of making synthesizing of ideas and meaning. What are all the data that come to us? What do they really mean? How do we create meaning? How do we craft and implement the strategy? How do we balance between core and new business? And of course, how do we recreate growth in our area? So therefore, one could say, if that is a challenge of management, how well does a ritualistic, if I could call it that, board with a weak governance, how does that actually help? Well, I couldn't give the answer, but I have been reading an article made by Professor Meyer from Yale University, who in 2010 made an interview with really many, more than 1,000 board members and executives across the Western world, not only in US. And he found out that 9 out of 10 board members really think they do a great job. He could have stopped there. I don't even think they needed to make a voting about it. They all agreed they did a good job. Then he asked the executives, and only 2 out of 10 felt that they got wise counsel. And some of them even felt that the collaboration with the board was directly motivating. So that's a big discrepancy in opinion, which I think is a warning light, saying to us, well, perhaps this board is not enough to live up to what the company needs, the future needs, and the management needs to go forward. Then you could ask, well, let's make some more rules and regulations. Let's pump in even more law stuff and decrees to make more compliance driven of those boards. Maybe that could help management. Well, my concern is that every day, not only in the banking sector, but spilling off from the banking sector, many boards are now met with such a tsunami of rules that they don't know what to do about them, and they might end up spending half of their time tick marking different compliance formula and living up to whatever comes in from the regulators. That's one point. Another point, and this slide here is my own subjective idea and opinion, but I have the feeling when I speak with regulators, both in Scandinavia and in Brussels, that they seem to me to be more familiar with what I could say the public sector and the financial sector and with the global business realities. I could be a little bit more rough and say not many of those have ever been in a company, have ever been driving a business company in competition with Chinese or Vietnamese or US companies. And therefore it's a little bit difficult for them to make rules that really facilitate the global competition ability going forward. So I'm not saying that I'm against all the rules. Many of those are really healthy and really good. We just have to be sure we find the right balance. That's my appeal. So my challenge or my problem is that if we get too much of this compliance drive in the board, then management starts to think, oh, we better mitigate or avoid risk. We shouldn't take any chances. We should consolidate. We should focus on the core business only, and we should apply rigid rules. I'm sorry about the typography has screwed up a little bit here, but I hope you can read it. So basically, I don't think that these more rules idea is really relevant compared to the challenges that the executive management team is facing today in many companies. And again, I can't speak about all sectors, only those that I'm familiar with. But in many cases, we really see a very turbulent environment. We don't know what happens a month from now in our industry. And that is challenging also for the board. Then we could say, okay, let's look at the American success because they are the biggest and the greatest and the best, at least they think so, and I think in many cases it's really true. So how about applying the American monolithic idea of a single string governance, where you have chairman and CEO who's running the company, running the management, and running the board? Maybe that's more easy, maybe that's better, because one guy can make quick decisions. And of course, we have this American hero cowboy picture in our minds. And I have been meeting managers who've been so influenced by, you can say, the American approach that they think or say, well, the board just has to get out of the way and not waste my time because I know what I want to do. And you could say, is that good governance? I'm not sure, because today the problem is that one brain or one ego or one team cannot cope with all the challenges that we are facing and all the turbulence around us. So therefore we need, in my opinion, a dialectic. I think it was Hegel, the philosopher, who talked about dialectic as an important mind way of working, and we don't have that in a monolithic system. So therefore, I also feel, if I should be simple, that the great American model is not necessarily solving the challenges that many managers have going forward, and is not being helpful for the owners because they don't know when the manager, like in Enron, not anymore has the right judgment. So you put all the eggs in one basket, you can say. So, in my opinion, the problem is neither of these traditional board thinking are so good. We need a new interactive board approach, which, as you hear us saying, is business-driven, which can provide wise counsel to the management, which can drive focus forward, which can participate, have an opinion about the strategy and participate, and of course, which can exercise control. Not control over the last 3 quarters of financial numbers, but control in the sense, is this company on the right track? Is this company really delivering on executing the strategy as we want it to do, or is it not? And that is, of course, an ever important challenge. So I then ask myself, how can that interactive board add value? Is it a postulate that holds true? Well, to start that thinking, I went back to a guy called Peter F. Drucker that you all know. I heard him a couple of times in a seminar here in Europe. He's a very good philosopher, in my opinion. And he said something that was, you can say, trivial, but not bad. He said, no organization can sustain if it cannot work under the assumption that its members, including management, are perfectly normal human beings. You might say, is that really necessary to be a professor to say such a thing? Perfectly, we are all normal human beings, but you must say that in the press, in the literature, when you read about the Iacocca, the Jack Welch, the Steve Jobs, and all great guys, they are almost superhuman beings, and maybe they are not the right ones to think about when we talk about the interaction between the board and the management. So you can say, very simple, that any executive management who deals with this complex world needs some kind of a dialogue in the team or with somebody who can give inspiration to the challenges it is facing. If the board is passive, then where do you get that dialogue from? How do you get that sparring? How do you get that inspiration? Well, some managers will talk with their colleagues. It's not so strong because there's a lot of inbreed mentally, thinking-wise. They can speak with peers, meeting at sessions and seminars and whatever, or they can speak with a spouse to the extent that the spouse wants to listen to that for more than a few years. So many of them end up talking with their dog. And that, of course, is sometimes helpful. Lou Gerstner, who turned around IBM in his book, How Elephants Can Dance, writes about that he walked on Long Island and talked with his dog about the mainframe business. But I don't think that is enough. What we need, of course, is to have this active board that I'm advocating, which can provide the counsel and drive the focus forward. Doing this, and here we are talking about the dual string model with 2 active entities. You actually have 2 separate roles, of course. You have 2 mindsets, because the mindset of management is so different from people coming in, let's say once a month, still have connection with the companies, 2 distances and 2 perspectives. And that is where the dialectic comes in. That is where today any problem that we are facing in our companies in dynamic markets, which most are, there's always several aspects to a problem. There's not one single answer. You have to think about it and reflect a lot, and that helps to have this dialectic going. Of course, there has to be a fundament, a shared vision, a shared belief in what we're doing is right. I can tell you that when Lego, the company making bricks, when we were in deep crisis in 03 time, it's a privately held company. If not the owner and the board had a deep belief that we would come through that crisis, we would not have existed, because things were really looking bad at a point in time. But we said, of course, children want to learn using their fingers and their hands and their brain, so there must be a reason for us to exist. But we were deep down in a bad hole, and only that helped us going. There has to be trust. Openness sounds nice, not always the case. Management has to invite to dialogue. That is also not the case. Sometimes management wants to keep the board apart and away so they can concentrate on the real thing and not spend time on the board. And there has to be mutual respect. Those fundamentals have to be in order, else it doesn't work. And of course, there has to be a division of work, of the role, the work roles. There has to be both closeness and distance. If the board starts to manage a company, or the chairman leans in over the manager, you take away responsibility and you don't get motivation. And there has to be clear rules about how to escalate if we have a crisis, whatever. And certainly also accountability. I'm not talking that it is not important. The executive has to be clear accountable to the board, which again is accountable to the owners. No question about that. But still, if we do that right, I have seen in several boards that we managed to change the agenda, and I think that is a topic for the afternoon session, which I will dive more into, where we actually, instead of having the traditional agenda with, of course, the protocols and management report, and then a lot of detailed reviewing of the financial numbers and the guideline accomplishment and so on, we actually concentrate that a little bit, and I'll show how we do that. And then we have more time. We, of course, are together more than just the morning before lunch. We spend the whole day, sometimes 2 days, in an offsite. But then we have time to really dive into strategy, into execution of the strategy. Sometimes, often, that is forgotten. And into what I call health, meaning, is this company, is a mindset fundamentally healthy? Are we getting complacent, a little bit arrogant? Are we losing grip of the details? Or what's actually going on? This latter part of the agenda often happens with the board alone. At least without the entire management group, maybe even without the CEO, where we just have to exchange viewpoints on what do we feel about what's going on in this team right now. Is something deteriorating? Because if the health starts to deteriorate, it will take maybe 3 years before we see that in the financial numbers. I'll come a little bit back on that in the next session. But let me now jump over, because time is limited, to the professional and personal qualities. And as I said before, this is just my own postulates, my own reflections from the little number of companies I have been engaged with. But overall, I will say that to do this, I talked about with providing wise counsel and driving forward the strategy and so on. At least some fundamentals are important to have, if not in every member of the board, but at least in some members of the board. One thing is line management experience. You have to have tried to get something to happen through an organization. And you have, as the other point, to have had a hands-on P&L, profit and loss responsibility. If that is for a small division or a small company or a big one, is not important. The fact that you know how you make profit. It sounds trivial, but you need to have tried that, because it's not always that easy. You have to have a combination of analytic and common sense. Sometimes when people become professional, there's only analytic sense left, there's no common sense left. And you need to be able, as the board member, to sometimes advocate that this is something we just have a common sense about, not necessarily a deep analytic sense. You need to have experience, sometimes from the industry, sometimes from another industry. Of course, if you are dealing with pharmacy or airplanes or something very complicated, you have to have some members on the board who really do understand the ins and outs of that industry. That's helpful. But you can also have too much industry knowledge so that you think that you know all the truth and don't ask the right questions. So therefore, it can sometimes be helpful, in fact very often, to have somebody who has been in the same war 2 years earlier, who has been tried to compete, let me use again Google or Amazon, in another industry, and know how you actually act in such a battle when that happens. So industries who undergone the same change can be helpful to have on the board table to inspire you. Wisdom from real organizational life. I don't know, wisdom, it's something that happens over time as you mature and have different experiences, but I think that's important to have been battling with an organization, making things happen. It's not always easy. Of course, independence and availability is an issue that often is discussed a lot on independence, but you simply have to be so independent that if something happens morally, ethically, economically, or otherwise that you don't agree on, you should be able to step down from that board and say, I don't agree on that. In a nice way, I will not step for election again. You need to be that independent. If you're dependent prestige-wise or money-wise or otherwise, it's not good. Availability, of course, it takes a lot of time today to be on a board. I would say in many cases 20 days per year or 15 days per year is what you at least need to consider if it is a decent board that you work on, sometimes more. Diversity is an issue that always comes in when you talk about competencies or qualities. And here people often talk about only one dimension of diversity, namely gender. And obviously that's one of them. But if I should highlight what I find is important is passport diversity. People should not come from the same country unless you are a completely local company. But most companies today are operating in an open world. So passport has to be really representing the markets that you're acting on. Age is not so important in my opinion because you do see people of a high age who are extremely active and extremely passionate about and completing up to speed with their brain. You also see people at younger age being less so. Length of service is important, however, I think, as a diversity issue, because if people have been too long on the same board, they start to become a little bit prisoner of their own past opinion. And therefore, I think it's so important that length of service is regulated one way or the other in the board when you hire people that you agree with. This is for an 8-year period or 4 times 2 years or whatever. And so in this way, you actually have a flexibility and a good way to start or stop the environment has to be different. Gender is fine if there are different genders represented, but personally I would say most of the boards I'm on, they are women, and nobody thinks about is that a male or female when something is being discussed. It's a brain experience, competence that's important, and not the format of the geneticals. Geographic vicinity is also important. You need to have people who live in Shanghai if you want to do business in China or somewhere over there, South America and so on. You cannot have people only from the same country. In Denmark, we've been very bad at this. Somehow Danes only have Danes on their board. Only like 10% or less are from other countries, where in Switzerland, Holland, Sweden, England, they are used to get people from other countries to inspire them. So that, I think, is important as well. Let me just leave those points and just say it is not enough that the board consists of, let's say, a collection of competencies, very strong individuals who have a strong profile. To really work, the board has to be a cohesive team, something that glued together, that has something to do with each other. And to do that, the board must share somehow an aspiration of how to be a team. Now it sounds really difficult, particularly for male over 50 years old. What does it mean to be a team? But that is incredibly important. Not every day, but maybe once a year, to talk about what is our aspiration here. And it's important that the spirit is such that it's straight, crisp, and honest in the debate, not only polite. And still people can drink coffee afterwards. And still there can be a connection, basic. People have to have the same basic understanding of what is the world about. And if you're politically or mentally or otherwise completely different, it's of course not so easy to connect. So it has to be a basic to build on. If I should dive a little bit more here, to me, when I look at the board members that I have been admiring in my practice, they all have a high degree of empathy. May sound trivial, but to understand what other people feel and think is so important, having, you could say, emotional intelligence. To be an active listener is very, very important, and the problem is that many of those who have been, let's say, successful CEOs or whatever, they have stopped the ability to listen because they always speak, like I do now. The ability to listen is so critically important to be a board member, because asking questions and listening is actually the most important instrument you have. To be reflective and humble. On Electrolux, we have a chairman until recently, Marcus Wallenberg, who is a very, very great person. And he's one of those I know in my memory who really was able to reflect and being incredibly humble. You couldn't tell that he was a chairman. Clear and precise is important. Sense of humor is also important. And I know you have great humor in your country, as I also think we have in Scandinavia, maybe except for the Finns. But that is important even in the darkest moment. that you can loosen up a little bit and have a little bit of fun now and then, even if it's all serious. Energy, passion is important because management should leave the board meeting being even more motivated than before it started, and not the opposite. And obviously integrity is important. Now, how do you develop that? I have no clue. I don't know. I don't even think there is a rule book for that. But some education, functional experience, line management, and some board experience, little by little, build some of that. Problem is, today, at least in Scandinavia, there is a tendency that people make a quick solution, and even when they are, let's say, 40 years or whatever, say, I want to get on a board, because it must be the end of the career. And so, without having a lot of experience from really driving a business, they start to enter boards, and even if there are quota situations like in Norway, you end up having persons on the board who may lack fundamental experience, and who just come with generic articulations, which does not give respect for other board members or from the management. And that could be a problem, I think, for boards if that happens too much. There also are board members who simply mentally retire when they are 40 or whatever years old. That also is not helpful. And finally, I have seen, in some cases, board members who became smaller personalities in some more power-driven, more dominant, and so on. And even one, what is his name? It escapes me. Harold Janine, the guy who ran ITT, he has made a book where he characterized these guys as egotists. Egotist was his word. Even one egotist can actually spoil the climate in an otherwise good group. It doesn't take so much to damage it. So if you have that situation where you end up in a passive remote board that doesn't really deliver what it should in terms of what we talked about with value, you do have a chairman, you do have a board, you do have a CEO, it is divided, but there is somehow a line here that makes it not so really interactive. You want to get over here to become more interactive, have an active chair, an active board members, and a good interface. You could say a little bit more idealistic, if you say. Now, to do that, and this is my last set of slides here, to me it is important to operate with what you call systematic self-evaluation, and I know that is a theme that will be dived much more into in the afternoon and in this morning. You have to execute on the findings from that evaluation. You have to have a strong board leadership, chairman or strong owners that can exercise change and active owner connection. Now, to do that, you need to have, let's say that is yearly, a kind of a review of the current performance. And we'll talk much more about that later. And out of that, you need to compare what do we do today with where should we be compared to the demands from the future if you want to survive the competition. And based on that, you may find that a couple of profiles are not so relevant anymore for a lot of good reasons. And you need a robust and honest talk about the future, what is it takes, and hopefully those members will find out that perhaps we should leave the seat for somebody who can better drive the company forward. And it shouldn't be too much because it has to be continuity at the same time. Also, you will find out from the strategy and the view of this landscape that you need certain profiles to go forward. I'm in one company where we used to do consulting on a person-to-person basis. We have now got a person in who understands social media, can help us take this into the next generation of what our future customers will want. Likewise, in Lexolux, we know that competition 3 years from now will not happen on Home Depot's floor. It will happen on the smartphones. And therefore, we need somebody who can connect us with the consumer in a completely new way, as we did in Lego, where we have managed to really build a strong connection with our playing children and families. So we need a succession planning, which is active, and that must be a task for the chairman to do that, and for the board. In Lexolux, we have a nomination committee where there are some representatives of the biggest shareholders, plus we are 2 from the board, and there we review very diligently what is the findings from the latest self-evaluation and what are the requirements going forward. And then we make typically a 3-year plan. What profiles do we need to get on board to drive this company in the right direction? It's not enough to decide on a CEO. You need to have the right backing group there. So if you do that right, over time, maybe 3 or 5 years, you will end up having a mix of talents which is having a strong cohesion, a strong team, and which have diverse thinking styles and which represents those competencies that you really need going forward. So my conclusion, and I don't know how the timing is doing. You are not looking angry, so it's okay. If we agree that the world is like this, and it's not the case in all industries, but in some industries, and we agree that the executive management has a challenge of synthesizing meaning, finding out what is up and down, crafting strategy, balancing core and new, and recreate growth of the business. If that's some of the challenges, well, then you could, that is my own word here, you could say this could be a third generation EMT challenge that we are dealing with. Now, if we take then a first generation historic board, obviously that cannot match that generation of challenges. Neither can a second generation formalistic board, no matter how many rules you start to implement, no matter how thick the books are of rules. What you need, obviously, as I've been advocating, is an interactive board, which is business-driven and still compliant with the key matters that really mean something. A third-generation board is what I would say. So this would be my contribution. The last slide here is stolen from a quote from Heidrich and Struggle, one of the search companies in the world. They said here, once being a board member was considered a nice way to ease into retirement. Now it brings a lot of responsibility and requires a rigorous and professional approach. And in England, for example, it's becoming even a personal liability. You can be personally sued if you do a wrong decision. So it's getting really, really tied up over there and other places in the world, I can tell you. So it is not only a moral obligation, it's also getting pretty hardcore what's going on in boards and the demands from owners and creditors and who else would be fighting you. So this is a new reality as I see it, and that is why I really look forward to listen to the other contributors and their views on self-evaluation and how we renew the board on a continuous basis. So thank you for that. I hope you have, it went quick, but I hope it went well.